Hello there, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Greetings from the unusually chilly Florida. No, we're not getting all the snow that most of North America appears to be getting lately, but it's a little bit unusually cold here. So, I hope you guys are well today. I hope if you're American, that you survived the Thanksgiving week okay. And that you're dealing with sort of this holiday time okay. I know it can be a bit of a struggle dealing with the holidays. I want to say hi to Jan. Thank you for being here. Today, actually, I want to talk about something that's a bit related to the holiday season, but to be fair, it's something we need to be talking about all the time. Hi, Carol. And so what we're going to talk about today is boundaries. You may have heard this term a little bit in your life, especially in your recovery life. I'd never heard this term when I was a kid, of course. Like, nobody talked about this. But I've heard about it a lot since I've been an adult, and especially since I've been doing this work. So I want to say hi to Katie. And there's a reason why that's the case. Because boundaries is absolutely critical to our success in healing. And more so in creating a life for ourselves that is our own and actually works for us. So even though it sounds like you may be hearing about boundaries a lot, I will say that it is definitely one of those places where it lives up to the hype. It definitely needs to be this hyped up. And I won't say that about everything. There's a lot of concepts that are kind of a big deal in spiritual communities and healing communities where I'm like, but this is not one of those topics. Boundaries is critical. Absolutely critical to our healing journey. As a matter of fact, we will not find freedom in this life if we don't learn how to set them. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm not trying to panic anybody, but they are one of the most critical components of a free, authentic life. And the truth is that we often did not grow up. In traumatic households, we don't grow up with boundaries. As a matter of fact, it's kind of the anti-boundary place, right? It's forbidden to have your own space, your own ideas, your own plans, even your own emotions to a degree is not acceptable. We can't, like, traumatic families just can't let somebody differentiate themselves enough to where they are potentially at sort of that danger point, being able to have their own thoughts, their own opinions, their own anything. It's too dangerous for traumatic families. They need to keep everybody enmeshed in this very toxic system, dissociated, right? Which is also a big, big core part of being free, right? So we often will set up our inner part system as children to resist the boundaries or the idea of setting boundaries almost entirely. We just completely resist this idea. So what does that end up doing to our lives? I'm going to talk a little bit first about the kind of impacts this lack of boundaries has on our lives. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what are some of the steps we can take to start having them, right? Because it's one thing to talk about it and say, yeah, this is the thing that's bad, but it's another thing to then know what we're going to do about it. And so I'm going to talk about both of those things. I'm going to start off talking about what not having boundaries does in our lives. And the first one is that we will, if we don't have boundaries, we will live in fear that others are going to ask us to do something or to help them with something or whatever it may be. We will live in fear that that is coming. Now, this is a flashback too, right? Because as children, we had absolutely no power. We had absolutely no ability to say no. There was nothing we could do. If somebody told us we had to do something, we had to do it. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't have emotional responses or we didn't throw fits or whatever it was. But in general, we could not get out of something that somebody told us we had to do, right? And this could have been a very mild thing, like you have to, go eat breakfast, or you need to get up and go to school. You didn't want to do it. Yeah, every kid deals with some of that to some degree. But in traumatic families, the requests are abusive in some cases. We still can't say no, right? So this is where things get really, really murky and messed up, and we start putting survival skills in place to be completely accommodating towards abusive people, because that's how we can survive, right? So that first one is we're living in fear of the requests that come from others, okay? So this is definitely something that flashback continues in our lives, and because of the flashback, we are often in a place where even in adulthood, we then can't say no to people's requests, right? So when I have this happen to a lot of my clients, when they start to really get settled into this idea of I'm going to live my own life, the next thing that happens is there's a lot of people who come in and start making requests. And our job on this healing journey is to start saying no. But it's extremely draining and tiring, and I'm going to talk about the best ways that we can do that. But it's definitely this fear and this actually kind of being in our system will actually manifest as we start setting boundaries and saying no to things. So the next one, anything we want to do for ourselves or something, let's say, that moves our lives forward in some significant way, will never get done. If we don't set boundaries, we will always be last on our list, right? We will really live our lives almost completely in service to others if we don't have boundaries, okay? So that's the second way in which we may be impacted. The third way is that it will also impact the types of people that we're bringing into our space, unfortunately. People who like the boundaryless come in a couple different forms. One of those forms is that they really may be looking for you to be their savior, right? They're like, oh, great, this person has no boundaries, so I can put all of my issues and all of the ways in which I need to be saved on them, and they will take it and they will save me, right? Like they will finally save me. Now, a lot of times this is love seeker behavior on their part, but then our boundarylessness may also be coming from our love seeker, but it also can be coming from two other parts. I call these the trifecta. I'm going to talk more about this too when we talk about steps, but the controller, the love seeker, and the karmic kid are what I call the trifecta. And they do have a tendency to engage with people that also have no boundaries. So these boundaryless people come in and they want us to save them. And then those three parts try to make that happen. It doesn't work out. We can't save others. That's not actually a thing. But we will give it a real good try. And in the process, we will very often lose more of ourselves. And have quite a substantial backlash in our system from it. So that's the first type of person that we can attract, which is already bad enough, right? But then there's sort of the second type of person, and these can be a bit mixed. Like we can have a little bit of both. Like not everybody is going to fall in one category or the other perfectly like that. But the other type of person is the one who just needs somebody to dump on, right? They just need to throw all of their crap at this person, and they know this person will take it and deal with it. They're not looking for a savior, at least that's not kind of what appears to be the drive. There may be a little bit of that in there, but more so, they're just looking for somebody that they can sort of have power and control over and just let them handle all of their stuff, all their crap, all the stuff they don't want to do. They just want someplace to dump it, right? So these are two types of people that we can unfortunately attract when we don't have boundaries. The truth is, when we don't have boundaries, we will not attract healthy people. We will never have somebody come along, right, who is like, oh, I see that you have no boundaries, but I'm going to respect your boundaries anyway. That's not a thing. There will be parts who think that needs to be a thing, okay? Like, there will be parts out there going, eventually I will find a person who respects my boundaries without me respecting my boundaries. You will not find that person. That person is not going to show up for you. They're not going to fix it for you, right? This gets back into that idea of the savior. That person isn't going to be there for us. Believe me, if they existed, I would have found them. I would have found them in my own journey, in my own attempts to find somebody who would respect me, even though I didn't have any boundaries. Now, they never came along. This is a big understanding and reality for us to help ourselves to get to, despite the fact that we've got that trifecta and especially that love seeker in there, really, really looking for that, okay? So that's not going to be there. We're not going to get those kind of people when we don't have boundaries, unfortunately. And then the last thing I want to mention around this idea of like how having no boundaries impacts us is the other way it impacts us is we will just get really, really angry. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that that's something that's obvious to most people. It may not even be obvious to you. A lot of times when we're getting more angry, we still have a really strong controller trying to block that anger for us, trying to make it not show up, not even to us on a conscious level. So what does that anger end up looking like in our system? A whole lot of things. I mean, honestly, one of the biggest ways anger shows up is as anxiety. Because while the anger is popping to the surface, the controller is blocking it. That sort of battle of the parts is what causes anxiety. It's not always anger that the controller is blocking, but when the anxiety is extreme and it's actually leading to the level of, like, let's say, panic attacks or paralysis, that is often anger. Okay, because anger is such an explosive emotion, it can take such a significant response from the controller to keep it from showing up. So that anxiety, when that anxiety is really intense, it is often the anger trying to come forward and say, can you please stop letting these people do this to you? That's what the anger is saying. We're not hearing it because the controller is blocking it. So that's one way anger can manifest for us. Another way that it can show up for us is in physical illness. There's a huge impact in the body when we are not expressing our anger and moving that anger out of our system. So we can start to get physically ill. As a matter of fact, a lot of times, you may have noticed this, when you don't set boundaries, you'll notice that suddenly you're getting sick. Instead of being able to do that thing for that person, there's a physical impact on your system to where you can't do that thing anyway. Those are the angry parts a lot of the time, saying, nope, not going to let you do this thing. You have sold yourself down the river enough. We're not doing this one. That can be, like, that physical impact can be the anger showing up for you, like that illness. But it can also show up in just general body pain. Sometimes I refer to this as trauma body, where all the joints hurt at once. That often has a strong anger component. Or it could just be passive aggression, right? Like, it shows up in our behavior even when we're blocking that anger. One of the ways it shows up is this passive aggression. Like, we'll do that thing for you, but we're not going to be super nice about it. That is us doing things we don't want to be doing for other people. So these are some of the ways in which we may be impacted in our lives when we don't have boundaries, right? So, and let me see, Bernadette is saying, hi, Elizabeth. Yeah, No, so hard for me due to my childhood. No wonder so much tension and fear now. Yes, it is incredibly difficult to set boundaries, but it will create a tremendous amount of tension and fear in the system. Most of all, because we are having to block that angry response we're having. And a lot of times, it's like the angry parts are yelling at the parts that are not letting us set the boundaries, or these parts are yelling at the angry parts. And it's this back and forth. There's a lot of fear in the trifecta. Those are the parts that don't want to set the boundaries. There's a lot of anger in the parts that do want to set they really want to put up walls when they're ungrounded. And so this fear and anger are back and forth, creates a ton of tension in the body, which is why I also mentioned the, body pain that can often be a result of this battle, the battle of the boundaries, we'll call it, in this situation. And I'll be honest, because the controller is on the side of not setting the boundaries, we can be really confused about it and not even really completely understand that we aren't setting boundaries until we start to set them. And then we start to realize, oh my gosh, like I actually needed to have a lot of these that I've not had. And usually it doesn't become obvious to us until we start going down this road, and then we realize just how many boundaries we need to set. And it's usually a lot, unfortunately. Caroline is saying, yeah, putting boundaries down seems wrong at times, and guilt. Yeah, I get very nervous when setting boundaries. Yes. So that is the perfect segue, actually, Caroline. Thank you. Into the discussion about how we do this. It's like, okay, great. We've talked about how bad it is for us to not have them, but how do we make them happen, right? I mean, if they've never happened for us before, it's like, this is not the water we swim in, right? Like, how do you change that water out? And so let's talk a little bit about that, because Caroline is right. The guilt. Oh my gosh, it's huge. It is one of the number one reasons we struggle to set boundaries in the first place. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how we even do this, right? How do we get started? And the first thing I'm going to say is you have to start small with a teeny tiny boundary, okay? Do not have your first boundary be like, I don't know, like no contact with everyone in your family or something. I mean, actually, that's never like a bad choice. But it's very, very, very big. And I will say that if we want the boundary to hold, start with something small. Like a small boundary might not be no contact with everyone in your family. Maybe a small boundary is, I am going to take the next couple weeks and just really spend it on myself. Like I'm not really going to be taking a lot of calls or texts. I'm not going to be responding to a lot of people. I just need a little time to myself. So that's a smaller boundary. Who knows? Maybe you just do it for a weekend. If that feels like all you could do before the guilt is going to kick in, then do that. The guilt's going to kick in no matter what. Let's be honest. But we want to kind of make that guilt a reasonable amount of guilt that we can work with. If it gets too strong, it's going to win. And we're going to break the boundary. Because, honestly, setting the boundary isn't always the hardest part. Holding the boundary is. Okay. So I want to be really clear about that. And this is, I work with a lot of parents of young children. This is a big one for us. And it's easier to find small boundaries with kids. It can be something like, no, I'm not going to let you have, this little thing, that stuffed animal or that blue cup or that whatever right now. It's, but you can have it later, right? For example, that kind of a thing. Start small. Start small. So that's step number one. So, so important. I'm going to read this message from Sage. She says, this resonates. Angry about not setting better boundaries with someone who kept pushing and then getting confused because this person also seems to care about me. Allowing myself to be easily subjected to feeling seen and loved. Hard to trust myself in these situations. Yes, it is hard to trust ourselves in these kind of situations because we have patterns that are not healthy, and they drive a lot of our parts. And while we're not saying we don't want to trust ourselves, we want to hear all of our parts out, right? And that includes the parts that are kind of making us feel like we can't do things for ourselves. We want to hear them out, but the key is we generally don't want to take a lot of action from these parts. So I always suggest to people, instead of hearing from these parts and doing what they say and then generally regretting it, we want to start expressing from the parts directly, like writing from the parts, hearing them out, but then not necessarily taking action from them. I like to say this is where we want to practice the art of the pause. And this is particularly helpful when parts start reacting to our attempts to set boundaries, because that is when things can get really strong. And look, people can care about us but not respect our boundaries, okay? Now, you could say they care about you, but do they totally respect you? I don't know. The thing is, it's not always black and white. People can care, but they don't have respect for our boundaries. That still might not be somebody that's going to be really positive in our lives. And so we need to ask ourselves those kind of questions. And that actually brings me to this next step here, which is don't start with your worst boundary invaders first. Now, what Sage is saying, it doesn't sound like you did that. You may have started with somebody who actually does have some level of care for you. But when we start off setting a boundary with people who have benefited from our lack of boundaries, or even taught us our lack of boundaries. So in other words, don't start with your immediate family. That's not the place to start. By immediate, I mean like your parents, your siblings. That's not the place you want to start. Actually, one of the perfect places to start setting boundaries, if you can, if you happen to have young children, that is one of the best places to start with setting boundaries. Because as we shift, our kids will shift with us. However, they will put up a pretty solid fight before they allow your boundary. So setting small boundaries with them and being able to tolerate their emotional response to that really builds up your ability to then set boundaries with adults. But what I will say is, if you have some friends in your life, or if you have a coworker or two who just is invading your boundaries in a couple ways that aren't really working for you, but overall seems like a decent human being, that is a good place to start your boundary setting. Because a lot of times we will get positive or somewhat positive responses. It also could be that there's a positive response, but then there's an inability to do what we're asking. You can repeat a boundary a couple of times, but then you have to start questioning, what kind of relationship this is going to be for you. However, if you start with, for example, a parent, the backlash from that person will be significant. It will be big. They set up your guilty parts. They created it. They made them be there. So they know exactly what to say to trigger those trifecta parts that I'm going to talk more about in just a second. They know what to do. They know what to say. If you're just getting started on boundaries, that's not where you want to start. Okay? Take my word for it. Start somewhere where you can get some small successes in there. Okay? But I also want to say really, really strongly that just because a boundary doesn't work with somebody doesn't make the boundary wrong. This is a big thing people think. I tried to set a boundary. It was a disaster. This is why I don't do it. I'm not doing it anymore. And I asked what the disaster was, and it said they didn't like it. Or they said no. That's not a disaster. That is telling you actually a lot of really powerful information about that person. And what you need to know in order to determine if you want to continue that relationship, right? That's what boundaries are doing. Boundaries are kind, right? They're saying, I am letting you know what it takes to be in relationship with me. And if the person said, well, I don't want to do that, then you have to determine what your next steps are, okay? So it is a kind thing we are doing. We are saying, I am willing to invest in this relationship by being vulnerable with you, by telling you what isn't going to work for me. And that's huge. That's big. It's big to do that instead of, for example, putting up a wall, which is honestly feels easier to us. And there's a lot of reasons why it does. But, a boundary is an investment in that relationship, right? So the first place to try out your boundaries are not with people who have generally disrespected your boundaries, like, for example, since birth. Don't start there. Start where there is a possibility of wins, because when you do start setting boundaries with those people, you will have a lot of no's and a lot of disrespect and a lot of it completely ignoring you coming in your direction. And you want to be sort of a bit stronger in your boundary setting when that starts to happen, because it will, unfortunately. That's a part of the process. Caroline is saying boundaries are my priority at the moment, and it's so easy to buckle because of the guilt, and sometimes people try to negotiate them. Oh, they do, yes. Having to set them with someone in my family, I tune into how I feel and go from there. There's been so many discrepancies happen. I feel I have no choice now, as I'm at the point in my life where I need to address things because of letting people off the hook in the past, that I was the one in pain and just not good at all. I've had enough. Yes, and a lot of times it's when we've had enough that we start to set our boundaries. Caroline, it sounds like you are doing exactly what you need to be doing here. You're setting the boundaries where you need to set them. So let's talk about the guilt for a minute. That comes from what I call the trifecta. There's three parts. I was going to say three. No, three parts involved in the trifecta. The controller, the love seeker, and the karma kid. They're going to hit you with heavy-duty resistance when you start setting boundaries, okay? And like I said, if you're setting them with family, the family even knows all the key phrases to get that resistance to come to the surface. Oh my goodness, they're so good at it. So we need to focus on expressing from the resistance of those boundaries. For the controller is always going to be focused on not rocking the boat. You can imagine this is pretty intense. For boundary setting, it doesn't go along well with boundary setting to not rock the boat. We are going to rock the boat when we set boundaries. Guaranteed. The controller will say, just do what it takes to be accepted. Just do what it takes to just go along with everyone. Just get along with everybody. You don't need to rock the boat. You don't need to stir things up. This is classic controller. So when you hear those kind of messages coming into your system, right from those are your controller. The next group we might hear from, the next part we might hear from, group of beliefs, is going to be the love seeker. Now, the love seeker is going to sound like a little child in many ways. They're going to be like, don't set that boundary because that person won't love me, and I need them to love me. And if you try to be someone that that you want to be, they're not going to like it. They're not going to like that. Right? So that's the love seeker coming in. And yes, they will whine like that. That is exactly what they will sound like in a lot of systems. Work with the part that is so afraid they're going to lose love if they set that boundary. That's your love seeker. Last, but definitely most important, is going to be the karma kid. The karma kid literally believes, because they have been told to believe this, that they are here to serve others. And so they're going to hit you with the most guilt of all. They actually are the owner of the shame. The shame is one of their primary emotions. So they're going to come at you with like, oh, that's so selfish. How could you be so selfish? You're making this person feel awful. You're horrible, horrible, horrible. Okay, this is a part that can be quite self-loathing when we start setting boundaries. That's because they've been taught to be this way. They didn't make this up. This is how the karma kid comes at us. So unfortunately, when you hear this kind of messaging, you do need to write from it. It's important. Let this guilt/shame come to the surface and be heard. Karma kid is the number one anti-boundary part. They're not your friend when you're trying to set boundaries, but they are in need of your healing. They learn this as a child from all the wrong people. Their source is not credible, as I like to say, but we do need to hear them out. Okay, so writing from these three parts will help you move some of that resistance out so you can hold that boundary, because that's what we want. We want to hold it. So keep giving that a try. So Jan is saying, such a great topic. Boundaries never set in childhood or even understood throughout young adulthood. Totally see how this affected relationships. So hard to hold them for sure. Yes, that's the hardest thing, right? So I'm so glad that this was helpful for you today. So Sage is saying, yes, just do what it takes to be accepted, right? Many times this has left me unsafe in more intimate relationships. I was scared and made poor judgment. Yes, that's exactly what it does. Our trifecta will try to tell us that boundaries are unsafe. But in fact, the lack of boundaries is actually what creates unsafe relationships. And this comes back to that point I made earlier, where we are often attracting people into our space who if we don't have boundaries, they don't want us to have those boundaries. So they are not actually the best people to have in our lives, generally speaking. So that's what I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for all your interactions, all your comments. This is a hot topic for us, right? It's always a hot topic. It never stops being a hot topic for us. It's a big one, and we gotta hit it head on. I love talking about boundaries. I love setting boundaries now. I didn't used to. It's so important for who we are. So thank you all so much for being here with me today and for commenting. And I look forward to talking to you again next week. And between now and then, go out and set your boundaries, especially around the holidays. Great time for setting boundaries. And I look forward to talking to you again next week. Thank you all. Bye.